So welcome to an early weekly Wednesday webinar. It's right here pre-harvest, and normally we maybe start towards that post-harvest time frame, but with the introduction of a new product for stock residue breakdown that we're going to do today, we thought that here at Newfields Ag we should hop on a training call and be able to present some good information about a product called NutriPhi. And you all know us as a company that researches, looks for, makes, and brings to market products of our own and products from other sources that provide excellent value and ROI to the farmers and to you as dealers that go out and represent our products. So today, we're going to bring on Josh O'Brien with YieldMaster Solutions. You know them as one of our preferred of excellent products, such as Invita, the nitrogen fixer, and products like Ion Effects, Soy Effects, Crown Effects that really are products that are very innovative from a biological standpoint for the things that they do in the soil and in the plants. So, we've been looking to fill this space for a need to kind of keep the biological activity moving throughout the year. And Josh brought this innovation to us, and we're bringing it into our lineup and getting orders for it already as we go into the fall. So Josh will give us an overview that really focuses on the crop residue breakdown, and then also the product can give us an opportunity to go into the manure management side for managing manure in cattle, hog, chicken, and so forth in terms of the pits or the both inside and outside. So with that, Josh, we welcome you to our weekly Wednesday webinar. And it's the first one here for the 2024 selling season here in September. So we appreciate the opportunity to learn from you. And as always, the attendees are welcome to raise their hand or ask a question as we go along, and we'll have question and answer time at the end. So Josh, welcome and take it away, sir.
Yes. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity. It's hard to believe that it is this time of year already, but as I mentioned earlier, it's cooling off and fall is here, and combines will be rolling if they're not already very shortly. So excited to talk to you about a product that is on the back end of the season more than on the front end of the season, like most of our products. So the goal today is to just educate you a little bit about our residue management product called NutriPhi, and we'll go through why we think it's maybe a little different than some other products out there and how it works and those types of things. And at the very end, we will touch on a little bit of Nutriquire as well, just for those guys that are going to be doing some cover cropping, winter wheat, winter crops, those types of things, on how you can quote unquote prep your fields for those crops as well. So I do have Jamie Jones on the call with me as well, our business development manager. So if you guys have questions, please don't hesitate to type them in the chat. She can read them off to me, or you can always just interrupt me and ask the question too. Either way would be fine. So without further ado, let's get started on this and get you guys on with your day. Okay, so I want to start with just what is residue management, because it's a pretty broad term and a lot of people think about it in different ways. So I think the most common explanation or thought process is that it's really any process designed to expedite the digestion of remaining crop residue after harvest. So as we continue to push the envelope with higher and higher yields, with plant populations, with all of those things, the good news is we become more profitable as farmers. The bad news is that we have more quote unquote field trash or field residue left over at the end of the season that we have to figure out how to convert back into the soil. So that's how most people would just think about residue management. So the reason that is important is because this field trash or this residue can essentially tie up important nutrients needed for the following seasons. And also, probably, equally as important is many pathogens and diseases can find a home in crop residue and which allows them to be active for the next season or two or three, right? So we're really talking about residue that can rob your next year's crop from the nutrients it needs and also create real estate for negative pathogenetic pressure to survive when we don't necessarily want that available for that next season. Last but not least, as we talk about field residue, essentially what we're looking at is a composting. If you guys think about it in very simple terms, we're trying to compost down carbon. And as we look at that, if we don't get it digested down quick enough and your C to N ratio, your carbon to nitrogen ratio gets out of whack, all of a sudden now that future nitrogen that you're putting into that soil, it's not all going towards that crop because it's going to get diverted to breaking down the carbon that exists in your field already. So if we have an out of line carbon to nitrogen ratio year after year after year, all that nitrogen you're paying for is getting, I don't want to say it's getting wasted, but it's certainly getting misused by breaking down excess carbon in your field versus being able to go towards the new crop to hit those yield goals that you want to hit. So it really is a big deal for farmers as they move, especially guys that are doing corn on corn year after year. So while the carbon digestion component is important, I also want to touch on today what I think is maybe equally as important, which is chemical residue management, right? So we don't think about that a lot when we think about residue management. We tend to think of the organic carbon that's left in the field. We don't necessarily put a lot of thought into, well, hey, we just sprayed a whole bunch of chemical on this acre year after year after year. What are we doing to help remediate some of that to make sure we're not having a negative impact on our microflora or our microbial colonies in the soil? So many of the chemicals that are found in herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides they're difficult to break down, right? And by design, they're difficult to break down. But the worst part that happens is if you get them where they break down partially or only halfway, and now you start to build up a chemical tolerance because the bacteria that they're supposed to be killing or the insects that they're supposed to be killing are only getting a half dose of that chemical the following season. So that's where you start getting the glyphosate tolerance and some of those things that happen in the fields. So this is another option to think about as we're looking at residue management, not just carbon, but also chemical residue management as well. So as Michael mentioned, we have a product called NutriPhi that we think checks the boxes on the residue management components that we're looking for. So NutriPhi bacteria can remediate various chemical residue that hinder beneficial bacteria growth and therefore can assist in regeneration of positive microbial colonies. So we're going to dive into that a little deeper here in a few slides. But we also have bacteria, excuse me, that aid in decomposing organic carbon while converting phosphorus and potassium to more usable forms for the following season as well. So NutriPhi is a consortium of bacteria. And as we look at the benefits of these bacteria, they have the ability to degrade aromatic chemicals found in agricultural pesticides and heavy metals such as chromium. They have the ability to decompose manure and plant residue, which converts organic nutrients, excuse me, which converts organic nutrients into soluble and usable plant nutrients. So again, that's that organic carbon side of it. Whether it be plant residue or that manure that you're putting in the field, digesting that down and freeing up those plant nutrients that are tied up in there. We can solubilize phosphates and mineralize potassiums, making them more available for plant uptake. We can degrade atrazine herbicide residue. So again, some pesticides and herbicides can persist in soils, which will affect the crop/plant production. Bioremediation practices to help remove and or degrade these chemicals are pivotal to regenerative ag. And last but not least, we have some nitrogen fixing guys in here that have the ability to convert nitrogen to more usable forms, right? So we talked about in the last slide, putting nitrogen down, making sure it gets utilized for the plant. not necessarily getting utilized to just break down, the organic carbon that's below the soil. So we have some nitrogen fixing bacteria in here as well. So really a full spectrum of bacteria that aren't just specifically going after one thing. We're kind of bringing the whole community to the table here. And why that's important is as you think about microbial communities and as you think about what they do, it is certainly important to have your more specific bacteria. For example, we sell a nitrogen fixing bacteria, a nitrogen fixing product. It does a phenomenal job of fixing nitrogen, but that's all it does, right? So as we think about a community, which is essentially what your rhizosphere is, right? That space between the root system there where all the bacteria tend to live. As we think about that rhizosphere, we want to think about that as a community. And if we overload that particular rhizosphere with one type of bacteria, it would be very similar to if we had a city or a small town, and in that small town, we had 500 firefighters, but we had no teachers. And we had nobody to work the grocery store, and we had nobody to work the municipality plant, right? We're going to have a very safe town if we ever get a fire, but everything else that we need to do, we don't have the broad spectrum community that we need. So that's the approach that NutriPhi takes in your soil as well. We're making sure that we get that correct balance into place to make sure that we have that broad spectrum microbial community to not only digest down the residue, but also make everything available and make everything work more efficiently the next season as you plant that next crop. Last but not least, we do have some guys in there that have the ability to oxidize and reduce sulfide and sulfate. So basically, we're converting that sulfur into more of a plant usable form, again, allowing it to be available for the crop the following season. Okay, so a lot of the issue with residue management products is how do you quantify the value of that product? And that's really what we're going to spend a little bit of time on here in the next couple slides, right? Because it's not necessarily as easy as, hey, I put down a product at V4 and on that part of the field, I saw an 8-bushel bump. There's a lot more that goes into residue management as we're looking at it. But the easiest way to look at it, in my opinion, is to think about just what we are unlocking in terms of the nutrient value. So we had a company out of Nebraska, an independent research group over there, applied NutriPhi after harvest on November 1st, and they applied it at 1 quart per acre with, I believe it was 3 gallons of liquid nitrogen. And then they measured the amount of residue in the field month after month after month, all the way up until they got to the planting season again on April 1st. And what they found was that from November 1st, the time that we applied it, to April 1st, when we were getting ready to start planting, they saw 25% less residue at planting. So the bar graph that you see here on the left-hand side, that's percent residue. And then on the bottom side there, you can see the month after month. So 25% less field residue is what they observed over that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-month period of treatment. So what does that mean, right? 25% less residue. Well, yeah, it's 25% less visual stalks out there that you're going to see, but let's put that into an ROI value here. Let's really look at just what that actually means. So on the top here, you're going to see a chart from Michigan State University. And this chart shows you the nutrient value of residue based off of what crop it is and based off of how many bushels per acre the yield was. So for our purposes, we're going to focus on corn stover or corn residue. So if we look at that on a 200 bushel crop, it's estimated that there's about 100 pounds of nitrogen, 50 pounds of phosphorus, and 210 pounds of potassium tied up in that corn residue at the end of the year. Let's take the number from the last graph that we just saw, that we can digest down 25% more of that residue quicker. If we can do that, essentially on a 200 bushel an acre crop, that means that we are unlocking or freeing up approximately 25 pounds of nitrogen, 12.5 pounds of phosphorus and 52.5 pounds of potassium for that next season that would not have been available. So that is really a very nuts and bolts analytical way of looking at what is the value of using a residue management product. Okay, I'm going to pause here for a minute because I've been talking pretty quickly and going through a lot of material quickly here. But so far, Mike or Jamie, do we have any questions in the chat, or is there anybody that does have a question? Okay.
Hey, Josh.
Yeah.
This is Brian. This is not Jamie or Michael, but I can talk like Jamie if you want me to.
That's okay. No, you can just talk like Brian.
Okay. All right. That's fine. There's a question from Jared asking about, has the nitrogen producing value of NutriPhi been quantified?
It has been quantified in certain application methods, and particularly on manure management, which I'll get into here in a few slides. In terms of field value, we have not looked at the nitrogen fixing component of NutriPhi or field because it is not labeled to go on a living crop. So it has to go over top of a crop that's been removed from a field. So that's why we haven't spent the money on justifying the, I guess our intention is to not sell it as an end fixing product on a living crop. Let's put it that way.
Thank
Good question, though.
Yeah, the numbers you provided on the screen here are good numbers as well. So thank you.
Exactly. Yep. No, I appreciate that. Okay. So for me, the organic digestion, right? The organic carbon digestion component of NutriPhi is fairly self-explanatory. It's fairly simple to understand, and it's fairly, I don't want to say common in the industry, but a lot of products will promote similar attributes, right? And they're good products, don't get me wrong. Where I think this product really separates itself is that you get an additional benefit stream of the chemical residue breakdown as well. And that's really what we're going to go through here on the next slide or two. So here's just a couple of examples as we look at herbicide residue remediation. So as we look at some of the more common brand names out there, Stinger, Curtail, Reclaim, the common active ingredient in those products is persistent in the soil and has a half-life of 2 months to as long as a year. So why is that important? Well, 2 months, think about that. Depending on when you applied that over your crop, yeah, if it breaks down in 2 months, you might be okay. But more than likely, if you're putting down a fall crop or a winter wheat or something like that, a cover crop, you're going to have some of that persisting in the soil. And if it lasts in the soil for as long as a year, now you're certainly going to have it for the fall crops and potentially even have some of that impact on spring planted crops the next season. So the good news is that it is entirely degraded by microbial metabolism. So as microbes digest down the active ingredient, they will break the bonds of that chemical, convert them into different, we'll call them food sources for other microbials to come and consume. And then over the course of maybe 4 or 5 different iterations, we're breaking the bonds and converting it to different forms of organic acids and enzymes. So it does happen naturally in your soil. That's how you get rid of some of this residue naturally. The downside is with how high with modern farming, we're putting down more than we can digest in an efficient manner. So what NutriPhi does is gives you that little boost of microbial populations to allow you to digest down some of that herbicide residue a lot quicker and a lot more efficiently. The other example would be glyphosate or Roundup, right? So typically it takes, as quickly as 7 days you can get rid of Roundup, but in some cases it may take 60 days to get rid of Roundup. So while we're probably not as concerned about the fall impact or the next season's impact with Roundup because it's gone most likely in 60 days, what you do have is if you have weeds that start to reemerge in that 7 to 60 day period, and they start to have a little bit of that residue that's left, and they're gonna get kind of a half dose of Roundup. Now you're starting to see the glyphosate tolerance build up in your field year after year after year. So with NutriPhi, again, we can add this into the program to be able to help put down more bacteria that when it is time to degrade down that glyphosate Roundup, then we can really get rid of it more efficiently. And so Monsanto itself, this is how old this information is. Back when it was Monsanto owned, came out with this in their own Monsanto backgrounder that, hey, glyphosate is completely degraded by heat, sunlight, and microbial metabolism. So we are putting down a lot more microbials to speed up that metabolism process. The last part I want to talk about when we talk about residue management is salt, right? I mean, a lot of people, this is a big impact in certain areas, and they don't really know how they can help. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Josh, it's Brian again. Before you get off, would you go back a slide yet?
Yep.
There's a question on that pertains to this, but more on the application side. So when you're applying NutriPhi, are there any tank mix restrictions? This is asking in particular about if you're doing a fall burn down,
Sure.
2,4-D or dicamba, can you mix NutriPhi in with that?
No, yes, absolutely. You can mix it in with that. There's no tank restrictions on that. In fact, again, it depending on where you're trying to deliver that 2,4-D or dicamba, it can potentially help that delivery mechanism into that weed more efficiently as well. I will say, just double check on the newer dicambas for like soybean, the Extend Max and those types of things. You do have to be labeled to go in with Extend Max dicamba, but Brian, I don't think that's what they're going to be using for fall burn down. If I'm not, they're going to be using more of the older dicamba versions. Is that right?
That's the way I understand it, Josh. Yeah, that's the way I
Yeah.
understand it as well. Yep.
Yeah. So when you're spraying soybeans with dicamba, Extend Max, Extend Flex, those types of things, you do have to get registered with Bayer to have the green light to do that. We are not registered with Bayer to do that on soybeans. But for fall burn down, it's more likely the older versions of dicamba that they're using as a preventative. So, but yes, short answer is we don't have any restrictions there. The bacteria will survive and they will thrive, and it's not. And we're going to talk about why here in a few slides.
Josh,
Thank you.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, so if we're breaking down herbicides, many of them are petroleum based, as well as you have salt and petroleum,
Yep.
based fertilizers and so forth. Because this is breaking down carbon structure, would this be breaking down any of that petroleum based material that in those applications that we've been doing with the chemicals?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I was almost going to put a chart in this presentation, which I'll show you guys at the very end. So one of the unique things about NutriPhi is that this product has EPA open water discharge certification. And the reason it got that certification is because they were using it, and they are still using it, in the oil fields of Texas and in Kansas and some other areas as a hydrocarbon remediation product. Essentially, they're using it to go in and break down the hydrocarbon bonds that exist in petroleum, and again, convert it to a different type of fatty acid that another bacteria can then digest, and so on and so forth. So in that EPA study, you have to prove two things. One, you have to prove that it's not going to kill any fish or minnows or anything else if it ends up in a water stream, right? But two, probably just as important, is you have to prove that it's actually effective at doing what it does. So at the end of this presentation, remind me, I'll pull up a graph and I'll show you that the EPA, not us, the EPA did their testing on aromatics and alkanes, which are two different versions of hydrocarbons. And petroleum falls into one of those. And the data suggests that we had a 99% breakdown after 28 days of the petroleum-based hydrocarbons. So yes, very effective at breaking down petroleum-based products and again, converting them to fatty acids that other bacteria can then digest down as a food source. So that's a great point, and I will show you that chart at the end of the presentation.
So in that regard, one of the keys then that's been proven with this product, based on what you've said, is that it does more than just stimulate biological activity for creating plant nutrients. It has remediation opportunities for us for the whole concept of we do spray chemicals that are helpful, but they're persistent, and then they can have negative effects going into the future, both for the soil and the plant. So what I like about that benefit is that we do some things, maybe there's some negative things we've done. We get an opportunity with this product to come in every year then and start cleaning up some of the additional problems that we've created now and in the past. So I really, when Josh had talked about this before, or mentioned this concept, and then into the chemical remediation, that really got my attention because I think it's an understandable differentiation and an additional value to us, maybe compared to some of the other products that may be on the market. And for those of you who work in the regenerative side, this is another avenue for working on the regeneration of your soils.
Absolutely. I would agree completely. So I'm going to keep moving for the sake of time here. But again, if you have questions, type them in or interrupt me. The last component that I like that maybe doesn't exactly fall into residue management, but it's salt. Salt is a big issue in a lot of areas. And it is residue. I mean, it is you're building up an unwanted thing in your soils, and how do you handle that? So this is true of NutriPhi and Nutriquire, because NutriPhi and Nutriquire are sister products. They for the most part contain the same bacteria, just different we'll call it recipes of the bacteria, different populations. But the bacteria create a glomalin, which is like a glue that binds salt to a soil particle. So when you get salt buildup in your upper, 6 inches of the soil, how do you get it to move? That's the hard part. How do you get it to get out of your soil, or at least get deep enough down that it doesn't impact the plant? So our bacteria will create this glue-like substance that will bind the salt to a soil particle. And while that doesn't change the EC of the soil, it does allow for the free-floating salt, that salt in your top 6 inches there, to move below the root zone during rain events, or in our neck of the woods during snowmelt. So basically what we're saying is that salt would persist in your soil. What we're able to do is attach it to a particle, allow for the rain or the snow melt or whatever water event to happen, to push that salt deep enough down that it's not going to interfere with your rhizosphere anymore. So we're not necessarily removing salt. We're not making salt disappear. I don't think that's a possibility, but we are getting it out of the way and getting it out of the quote unquote danger zone of where our root system wants to grow, and allowing it to penetrate deep enough down that we're not going to have an impact on the plant performance that following season. So this is out of Illinois here. You can see the left-hand side is the control and the right-hand side is the treated. Again, just treating that field with NutriPhi to help penetrate that salt deeper and deeper and deeper year over year. I will say this is not a quick fix. This is not a one application this year and hey, I don't have to ever have to worry about salt anymore. This is a program mentality. If you have customers or if you have farm ground that has persistent issues with salt, this is something you should build in as a program mentality year after year after year to help eliminate some of that salt stress that you get. Okay, so let's just talk about the actual program, right? How do you use the product? Well, that's the simplicity of it. It's a very easy program to use. This would be what I would call our maintenance rate. So 1 quart of NutriPhi with 2 to 3 gallons of liquid UAN. So put it with 28 or 32. The reason that we're doing this with 28 or 32 is twofold. One, liquid UAN is a bit of a stimulant for bacteria, right? So it gets our guys going faster, but it also keeps them working longer in the fall, keeps them that temperature up warm a little bit longer for us to be able to continue to be active. The other reason that we're putting a little bit of UAN down, I mentioned it earlier on in the slide process, is that we have that carbon to nitrogen ratio. So when we're looking at the carbon above ground, one of the issues we have is we don't have it, deep down in the soil where there's a bunch of nitrogen sitting around it, that balance is going to occur. So if we're trying to break down stalks that are sitting on top of the soil, how do we make sure that carbon to nitrogen ratio is in balance? Well, we're going to put a little hint of UAN down with our application of NutriPhi. So now we're getting the recipe to be dialed in, and we're bringing all of these carbon digesters now that are going to be starving and hungry and looking for their next food source, and boom, they have a perfect situation sitting for them right on top of that field. So that's why we want to do it with UAN. 1 quart as a maintenance rate. If you have some bigger issues going on in your field with chemical residue, salt residue, or you've just done corn on corn on corn on corn for 10 plus years, and your residue is getting out of control. If you want to bump that up to 1.5 quarts or 2 quarts, you're certainly welcome to do it. There is no negative impact in terms of the quantity of the product you put down. It just comes down to financials on what you can afford to put down year after year as a program approach. The other tip is, we want to get it down as soon as possible after harvest. So bacteria, all bacteria for the most part, go dormant at some point in the winter, depending on when the temperature drops down cold enough. Our goal is to get it down as quickly as possible, so we have as long of a window as possible in the fall to break down that residue. But here's the cool part. These are spore-forming bacteria. They're going to go dormant through the winter. And when temperatures become warm enough in the spring, they're going to wake right back up and become active again and start that process in the spring on that residue that's been sitting there. So yeah, if you apply it and you get a really early fall that you weren't anticipating, or excuse me, an early winter that you weren't anticipating, don't feel like you just wasted your money, because as soon as spring comes and that temperature warms up enough, those guys are going to get back to work. So any questions on just applying it or the program, those types of things?
Josh,
Okay. Yep.
order of application, I would assume we'd want the NutriPhi down before ripping or any stock chopping.
Yeah,
Or
I mean, ideally, if you could, just because then you're going to get it, worked into the residue a bit more efficiently. And so I would try to, if possible.
One other question. I've got some guys that are looking at releasing cows out on the cornstalk ground. It would seem that in breaking down that residue, it would only impact the cow's ability to uptake nutrient value and better digest what they're eating. Is that pretty fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, I can't, from a legal standpoint, get into feed efficiency of it all, because then I'm going down a different pathway. But I can tell you that in layman's term, if we're breaking down those stalks, we're essentially making that fiber a lot softer and more digestible. So it's they don't have to eat through as much of that veneer that is kind of on these treated stalks today versus ones that are in the old days are more conventional. So yes, it is going to be a lot softer material for them to digest down. So if you could probably use your imagination on that, take it to the next step on what that would mean for feed efficiency and those types of things.
Thank you.
No, great
Josh,
question.
there was a question in the chat box. How
Sure.
does tillage impact bacterial life, such as disking stalks?
Yeah, that's a little out of my wheelhouse. I'll give you my educated guess, but there's probably people on this call that may be better equipped. Brian, I would think maybe even is with his background on equipment sales that can answer this a little bit better. We know tillage has an impact on bacteria. It does have an impact on the microbial colonies. It can impact the spores. It can impact all of those things. So year after year tillage certainly can have that negative impact. Even something as simple as just drying out the top 2 or 3 inches of the soil to where your aerobic bacteria start to die off is an impact. What that impact is, I honestly couldn't tell you just how significant it is. But I will tell you that there is a reason that no-till guys claim that they have a more robust microbial community, and that they can withstand some of the stresses that Mother Nature throws at us a little more efficiently than guys that do a lot of deep tillage. So I don't know, Brian or Michael, if either of you have a comment on that, I would welcome your opinion as well.
Gosh, the only thing I'll add to that is it's similar to what Dan's question was. I think order of operation, if you're going to do something like that and then apply this product, you could see the fact that you're going to be exposing some more of the root mass, the root ball, and that type of thing to help with that degradation piece. Obviously, in trying to keep that microbial life, like Josh just said, in that top couple inches, we know that the best way to apply iron is not by pulling it through the ground. All right, so we need to make sure that we're doing that as well. So it's I I would use it where you need to. We know there's soil types where you still need to be able to do that, but you know, you want to look at that too. So yeah, this product works for the application side of it. If you need to do some tillage because of the soil type, I would wait and do this application after that tillage.
One more
Great comment.
question in the chat box.
Yep.
Are there any fungal species in this product?
No, not any labeled fungal species. Let's put it that way. I will get into a slide here in a little bit that talks about some fungal species though, and I'll make a more in-depth comment on that question though. So I don't mean to avoid it by any means, but I do have a slide coming up that will talk a little bit about fungal species. Okay. So just to summarize real quick, as we look at the ROI of applying NutriPhi from a residue management standpoint, the obvious one, and I pulled fertilizer prices from online, you know, Farm Progress or something, one of those websites here. As of August 30th, basically, if you look at that NP&K based off of that 200 bushel crop, and based off of the fact that we're unlocking 25% of that, it's about $40 an acre more nutrient availability that is available to the plant in the spring. Again, that's a very nuts and bolts analytical way. Do I think that is the leading benefit of this product? Probably not. I think it's a really, really nice benefit, but I think as you look at a lot of the other things that this product does that you can't really quantify from a value standpoint of dollars, that those are probably more important. The other thing is, as we looked at planting, if we can improve that seedling bed, we can get rid of some of that trash that's in that furrow in that seedling bed. Obviously, you're going to get improved germination, better early vigor. A lot of times you'll have, you know, some residue that will be right next to a seed. And again, that's robbing that seed of nitrogen because it's using it to break down that residue. So improved seedling bed, better germination. And then again, less pathogen pressure for the following season's crop, right? If we can digest down some of that housing where those pathogens want to exist and want to hide out until the next year and expose them, then we can get rid of some of that pathogen pressure for the following season. So those would be the three kind of big ones that I would look at. I would say that I could honestly put a list up here of probably 20 other, you know, ROI benefits, but for the sake of today's presentation, I just kind of highlighted maybe the top three that I look at when looking at NutriPhi ROI. Okay, I'd be remiss if I didn't at least mention real quick that organic carbon is organic carbon. It doesn't matter if it's in a field or if it's in a manure pit. We digest it down and break it down. So a really popular use for this product is in swine pits, dairy lagoons, cattle confinements, those types of areas where our bacteria can go in, digest and suspend solid accumulations. We can increase pit and lagoon capacities by digesting down the sludge and solids in those lagoons and those hog pits. We can reduce fly populations in hog pits. If we get rid of that surface area, that crusting on top by digesting it down, now all of a sudden flies don't have a place to lay their larvae. We can crash 2 fly populations in a row, which is about 14 days. You've now gotten rid of your fly population for the most part. We can improve the air quality around the manure. Again, we talked about this has nitrogen fixing bacteria. It has sulfur reducing bacteria. If we can capture some of that ammoniated blow off the pit, that's less ammonia that the pigs have to be around. That's less sulfur that's blowing off of that pit, less hydrogen sulfide blowing off of that pit. We have a better improved air quality. And I will tell you right now, the EPA is stepping in already and investigating CAFO operations for air quality. It's only a matter of time until some regulations start happening in that area. Again, improving the nutrient value of the manure. If we're allowing less nitrogen to blow off of that pit, we're keeping it in the manure. So our nitrogen levels are going up. I would say on dairy lagoons, we have data that would suggest about an 8 pounds per 1,000 gallons of manure more nitrogen. So do the math on that. That's a significant amount more nitrogen on a 1 million gallon lagoon. That's 8,000 gallons, 8,000 pounds more nitrogen. We're minimizing the agitation. If we have less sludge and less solids in there because we've digested down that organic carbon, that's less agitation that needs to happen to get the manure back out of the pit. So that means that there's less diesel fuel that needs to be spent. That means that there's less off gassing coming from that pit, and it's less time and labor to get that manure back out. And last but not least, again, this is kind of working its way backwards. We're starting in the pit, but ending up in the field in this scenario. You've now just taken all of our bacteria that you would have applied for residue management, and you've been growing it in your lagoon all season long. Now you're taking it out to the field. Every benefit that we've just talked about the last 30-35 minutes, you're going to get those benefits when you take your manure out to the field, because you've been growing our bacteria in your pit for the last 9 months. So really nice kind of 1-2 punch. Start it off in the pit, let it finish off once you take it to the field. So that I didn't want to spend a lot of time on the manure side of it. If you guys have questions on the manure management part, I can certainly do more one-on-one consultations with you, and I'd be happy to do another webinar specifically just for manure management. But today I wanted to focus more on the field residue management side of it.
Yeah,
Josh,
Josh, question.
Sure.
The question is how about using this for just piles of manure that have been worked up, spread them out, spray this on, start the process from a composting standpoint?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, this product, they do thousands of acres of windrow composting with this product in the South on cattle manure. But as we look at piles that are stacked up, we call those more or less static compost, meaning it's compost that doesn't get turned by a windrow. And the problem with static manure piles is you get heat cones. You get some parts of that pile that will get ultra hot, and you get other parts of that pile where the bacteria just haven't gotten to, or there's less carbon in there or whatever. So it's not a very consistent material load. So by putting NutriPhi into those static piles, what you do is you spread that heat cone evenly throughout the entire pile. And if you can do that, now your NP and K is going to be a lot more consistent through the pile. Your digestion of that carbon, that straw that's in that pile with it, and that plant nutrients that went through the cow, that's going to get digested down more evenly, and you're basically going to have a lot more of a consistent product when you go apply it to the field. And then the added little kicker is, that pile is venting ammonia or ammoniated nitrogen. We are capturing a portion of that ammoniated nitrogen and keeping it in the pile as well. So I would highly, highly recommend, if you have a compost pile or if you have a static pile of manure that you're not turning with a windrow, that this is a critical need for those in terms of getting a consistent finished product. Any other questions, Jamie?
Yep, one more in the chat box. If injecting in soil, will it still do a good job of breaking down residue that isn't incorporated in the soil?
Yeah, so it's probably not going to work its way up the plant, the dead residue. So if you inject it into the soil, your field residue that's on top of the soil, we're probably not going to have much impact on that, unfortunately, just because that field residue is already dead. So the bacteria, even if they're endophytic, they don't really have much reason to try to enter in through a root and go up into a dead tissue. So yeah, foliar application is how you would get it on top, to make sure that anything on top of the ground is going to get digested down. Otherwise, anything that you've already turned under into the soil, if you do inject it, you're going to get that benefit of anything that's below ground in terms of that. But I will say a lot of pathogenic pressure does live on dead root tissue. So from a pathogenic standpoint, you are still going to have an impact on trying to kill off and take away some of those spores that can come up and rear their ugly head the following season. Great question. Okay, I will keep moving here. I'm not going to go through this slide. Again, if you have questions on the manure management side of it, happy to talk to you offline, and I'm happy to give you more of a formal livestock presentation on that. Just for the sake of time, let's focus more on plant residue today. This is going to tie into what we've been talking about here, is particularly on the fungal question that I got. So Brian had also asked that I just touch briefly on those of you that are planting winter crops or cover crops, quote unquote, prepping the bed for, or prepping the field for those crops with Nutriquire. So again, spore forming bacteria versus live bacteria. We've talked about this a lot, but in a live bacteria situation, you apply these bacteria to your soil. they come across, heat, chemical, drought, whatever that stress is, they die off. Spore-forming bacteria, which is what NutriPhi and Nutriquire contain, they come across those stresses just like live bacteria do, and they may die off. But in the meantime, they've laid a whole bunch of spores that hatch, and when conditions become ripe again, they'll come back alive. So the reason I like to talk about this when we're talking about winter and fall crops is you are still going to get a lot of benefit out of a fall application that following spring. The bacteria may go dormant, the spores will go dormant, they'll survive in the soil just like natural bacteria do. And when conditions become ripe in the spring, boom, they wake up and they get back to work. So you're getting the benefit of everything that you're doing in the fall, plus a portion of those spores and that bacteria survives into the spring and becomes active again. As we look at why would you want to use Nutriquire in the fall on winter crops or cover crops? Again, a lot of it's this early advantage that we're going to see. Competitive exclusion, which is, two species competing for the same resource, cannot coexist. So now chances are we've probably got some fungal pressure in your field. We've probably got some negative bacteria in your field just from the course of the summer. And you're going to be planting a winter crop right into that. And those guys are already awake and active and going. So they're after their food source, right? I use little hamburgers here as our food source as a simple analogy. We have a bunch of negative bacteria that want to digest that food source down. And then they want to repopulate once they do that. If you allow that to happen, your pathogenic pressure or your negative bacteria pressure gets out of control. What we want to do is when that food source becomes available, we want our positive microbial communities in NutriPhi and Nutriquire to be there to consume them. And if we can consume them instead of the negative bacteria or the pathogenic bacteria, guess what? We can start starving them out. We can start getting rid of those guys by just taking their food away from them. And then our guys can start to repopulate, and we can start to put down a whole bunch of positive phosphorus solubilizing and potassium mineralizing and nitrogen fixing and all kinds of other really positive bacteria, allow them to flourish in your soils. As you put that kind of field to bed in the fall, guess what? Now in the spring, you have a lot better starting point when that field wakes up in the spring and gets ready to go. Same can be said for real estate, right? Just because we're planting a winter or a cover crop does not mean that the bacteria don't want to colonize the rhizosphere or don't want to colonize the root system. Right? Those negative bacteria, they want to colonize that root system. And if they can take hold of it in the fall, guess what? They're going to be there in the spring, right? So our goal is to make sure that our positive bacteria, our beneficial bacteria, can colonize that root system more efficiently and more aggressively than the negative guys do. So not only are we going to get more plant vigor and plant promotion in the fall, but when we start the spring off, we're a step ahead on making sure that we can own that real estate from those spring-based, pathogenic pressures that we tend to see in wet, cold soils. Okay, so I kind of made a list. Why would you want to prep a field with Nutriquire or NutriPhi for spring planting? Number one, it's going to help trigger the biological process such as development of fine feeder roots. So if we can get that crop off to a really good start in the fall, if we can get that root system to flourish and develop in the fall, number one, we're going to have a better overwintering, we'll call it, right? A better survival rate coming into the spring. But number two, now we've gotten a lot more straws put into the soil when spring comes that we can pull in more water, we can pull in more nutrients, we can get it off to a better start in the spring and ultimately lead to better yields. To the question about, do we have fungi in here? We do not, but we have bacteria in here that will help encourage the sporulation and the colonization of mycorrhizae fungi, as well as improve nodulation of legumes. So what I mean by that is there's a lot of data out there that says, Trichoderma harzanium works really well in this capacity, and Bacillus subtilis works really well in that capacity. But there's more data that suggests if you put the two together, holy cow, is that a nice 1-2 punch? Because they're both emitting different organic acids and enzymes that feed each other, right? So we're putting two things together that will benefit both parties. So we can help encourage, even though we're not putting down mycorrhizae fungi or trichoderma fungi, by putting down the bacteria, we're giving them a lot better atmosphere to survive and to live in. Therefore, we're increasing their populations through that process. So hopefully that answers the question that we had earlier about, do we have fungi in the product? Again, we can help trigger that biological process involved in germination. So if you want to get that winter crop up and out of the ground as quickly as possible, we trigger that and you get more even and more consistent germination. We also trigger the induced systemic response, basically the immune system of the plant. We get that thing up and going as quick as possible. So if that plant runs into any fall issues, it's already got the immune system on guard to make sure that we can protect against it. We do have an antagonistic defense against soil-borne pathogens. So more than likely, we're going to have some soil-borne pathogens in the soil at the end of the season. We have a little bit of a defense mechanism there built in to protect that winter crop or that cover crop against it. Basically, we call ourselves the first biological line of defense. So again, that goes through that competitive exclusion that we talked about in the last slide. And then last but not least, we have that immediate colonization of PGPRs, plant growth promoters, to help solubilize nutrients for better and quicker uptake. So if we're getting more nutrients to that cover crop or to that winter wheat, winter grain crop, we're just getting it off to a lot better start. We're allowing it to run a week or two ahead by the time it gets to the point where it's going to go dormant for the winter. So those would be the reasons why you'd want to look at Nutriquire or even potentially NutriPhi as a prep for your winter crop. Is there any questions on that part?
One question in the chat, Josh, is saying it helps defend against Fusarium.
Mhm.
Are you saying it would help defend against Fusarium and sudden death?
Yes. Yes, we have data. We have quite a bit of data actually from Kansas, third-party data that shows Fusarium head blight and some of the other Fusariums, significant reduction in the occurrence of that using Nutriquire or potentially NutriPhi, depending on what time of year you're applying it. I will caution you, especially because this is being recorded, we are not EPA certified as a biofungicide or a biopesticide. So when we talk about how we do that, we have to correlate it back to the competitive exclusion side of it. But I will also say that if you guys are interested, you could look at our label. You could look at the bacteria on that label, particularly the Pseudomonas betida and the Bacillus subtilis. And there is a whole bunch of academia articles out there showing the impact that those strains of bacteria have on pathogenic things such as Fusarium and the ability to puncture the lipids or the fatty cell walls of those pathogens. Okay. Any other questions, Jamie?
That's it.
So last but not least here, again, to kind of go back to that fungi question, this is, I got a lot of questions this year about, hey, you know what, I used to use a trichoderma product and I can't use it anymore, or I'm moving away from it for whatever reason. How does your product compare to a fungi-based trichoderma product that we like to use in the fall? So I made a little slide that basically kind of sums up the benefits that most growers use trichoderma for. And then, do you or do you not see those same benefits with one of our strains of bacteria called Bacillus subtilis? So a lot of guys will use trichoderma to increase root production, to stimulate the crop's immune system, to produce those antibiotic acids and enzymes, to enhance that nutrient use efficiency, and to produce growth promotion agents such as indolacetic acid, right? And trichoderma does a phenomenal job at doing that. But guess what? Bacillus does a lot of that same thing. Now, it may not be apples for apples the same on how it does it, but you get the same benefit structure in terms of what you're looking for out of Bacillus. Last but not least, again, if you have trichoderma levels in your soil, adding a product like Nutriquire or NutriPhi can help promote the regrowth or the repopulation of those fungal beneficial fungi as well. So I guess I'm laying it out there that if you're used to using a trichoderma-based product or a fungi-based product, not necessarily that is bad or move away from it, but you can get a lot of the same benefit from using a product like NutriPhi or Nutriquire, or even combining the two together is a 1 + 1 = 3 type situation. So that is where I will end today. I will open it up the last 5 minutes here for any additional questions that you guys may or may not have, but I wanted to leave a few minutes at the end for questions. I moved through a lot of information pretty quickly there.
Josh, did you want to show that slide on that EPA information further? Is there any further information on that?
Let me pull it up here real quick, and I will show you guys the proof in the pudding, so be it, as we would call it. So while I'm pulling that up, is there any other questions?
And we apologize if the meeting gets cut off at 9:30, because that's sometimes teams will do that. So apologize in advance if that happens. Thanks, Josh.
No problem.
Josh, one of the other questions that came up, availability of product for this fall.
Yep. So I have a semi load of it leaving Texas yesterday. It'll be in South Dakota tomorrow, and from there, if you need it, we'll have it available. It's primarily available in 2.5s at this point. If you need totes of it, it does come in 275 totes. So if you need a tote of it, we can get that to you. We'll probably just direct ship it from Texas, however.
So the value just went up. I mean, coming out of Texas, the value just went increased greatly. So there's no premium for that, obviously.
That's right. Well, you know what though, Brian, you do make a good point. The reason that it comes from Texas is because the bacteria are produced in Texas, and it goes through a 10-month process of going through the Texas heat and drought and rain and dust and wind and everything else. And at the end of that 10 months, we basically bottle up, the strongest of those species that have survived. So they are, for better or worse, Texas strong, I guess you would call it, by the time it's all said and done. Okay,
We
do have that.
We call them stout, Josh. It's okay. We just call them stout.
Okay, let me share my screen one last time real quick here, and just in case it gets cut off, and show you guys that chart from the EPA. If I can figure out where I'm at. Here we go. Okay, so it's a little bit hard to see here, but again, this is from the EPA. This is not our study, but they looked at alkanes and aromatics, and if you think about that, petroleum would fall into this alkane category of hydrocarbons. So the control means, hey, we didn't touch it at all. Over time, it broke down by 53% over the 28 days. When we added in the NutriPhi, though, it broke down 99.2% of that hydrocarbons was broken down after 28 days. Aromatics are a lot more difficult to break down. Those are things like benzene that have those 6-ring carbon structures. Are really difficult to break down over time. And again, we broke down 60% of that over 28-day period versus, the control that was just a 40% breakdown. So it is extremely effective at breaking down hydrocarbons such as petroleum, or even the more complex hydrocarbons like benzene and some of those things that are, kind of nasty and found in the soils year after year. Any last questions?
Josh, thanks for the in-depth coverage of this, as far as the overview of this goes, and getting into some of those things. And guys, this is another one of those products that we're excited about. We have the opportunity to bring, because of our partnership with Yieldmaster and Josh and Jamie, supporting this product and helping us with it. As Josh said, we've got product available here that, as you start getting into this harvest season, we want to get these orders in, and so we can get them done. We'll be working to get them shipped, directly out of South Dakota, so we can get those things over there to you quicker, and so we can have those communications. This fits in with that, the whole system approach we're talking about, making sure that we are more efficient with and for our farmer partners, to make sure that their nutrients that are available are used more efficiently and effectively in the soil. And we feel like this fits right into that program, and that Josh has brought this to us and allowed us to be able to present it to you. We wanted to have this meeting, obviously, to kind of show those out, and it fits in, with what we're doing going forward. So thanks, Josh. Appreciate that information.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. And as always, if you have any further questions, don't hesitate to reach out.
Hey, Josh, this is Jeremy.
Yeah.
I just had one quick question. How would you, so a lot of no-tillers appreciate the cover on the ground, but yet they're having some problems with it. So what would you say to a guy that is a little nervous to try it just because he wants some cover on the ground? How much, what percentage you'd have left, and are you still going to have some of that outer stock there to keep the ground covered?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say to those guys that this isn't a miracle product to where, boom, all your residue is just gone, right? So what it does is it digests it from the outside in. So more likely than not, what you're going to see is that you soften up those stalks. So you're not necessarily going to remove or get rid of all that residue in terms of it disappearing. You've softened it up dramatically. You've taken away the edges on it. And then basically when the spring comes, that can then get digested down a heck of a lot more efficiently throughout the course of the summer as well. So I don't think it's going to be enough of a disappearing act that they're going to lose their ground cover that they're wanting, but it is going to soften up the stalks that are there enough that basically they become a lot more available in that next growing season. So the other part of it is no-till guys, they're still also going to have some below ground issues that they got to figure out, like how they handle pathogen pressure year after year after year, some of those types of things. And this is going to have a huge advantage for that part of it as well. So I actually think it's probably more important for no-till guys than guys that are doing tillage, because, at some point they still do need to break down those stalks and make that nutrient available, and it's tied up. So for those guys that do no-till, a lot of times they see a yield drag, particularly the first couple of years. And that's because that carbon to nitrogen ratio is a little bit out of whack. So if we can help them get that digested down a little bit more efficiently, get that balance back to it, and then hopefully they won't have that yield drag moving forward. Anything else? Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity. If there's any further questions, reach out to your Newfield Ag team and they can get a hold of me.
Josh, thanks for taking the time today, and we'll archive this presentation, and we'll send it out as a link if needed, and we'll put it up on our YouTube channel on newfieldsag.com. And we'll look forward to having you back in the near future to visit on the manure management side. And as we get into post-harvest, we'll talk about some of the other new products and dry powder products that we're bringing out that you all are taking a look at also. So wonderful time together today. Contact your business development manager for further questions, for pricing, and we'll be ready to ship product as soon as you're ready to apply. So thank you all for attending, and as always, I'll stay on, or we can stay on a little bit after the ending here in case someone wants to chat on this subject or another subject before we sign off.